Kevin, it's great to be joined by you once again today after day 3 of the proceedings for Julian Assange's extradition hearing in London. I was following your thread on Twitter. There was a lot of talk about whether the charges that the United States is trying to extradite Assange on relate to political offenses, the sort of application of the treaty and domestic international law. Why don't you just dive right in and tell us sort of what you heard today and what the main takeaways are?
First, I think it's worth addressing the drama that unfolded in the afternoon around Julian Assange pleading for more access to his attorneys and essentially saying to the judge that there's already been enough spying on him and his attorneys, believing that he's still having his privileged communications violated. At the moment, we're hearing that the defense is going to make some kind of an application to the judge and to request some kind of process to be undertaken so that he could maybe sit with his attorneys because he's having trouble following along. He would like to be able to consult his attorneys during proceedings. For people who don't understand the setup of these proceedings, there's a dock. Julian Assange sits basically in like a glass box and he's isolated. And then you have the lawyers from the prosecution and defense that sit at a table that's, for the most part, connected as one continuous, I guess we'll call it a bench. And they're all seated there in the well of the courtroom facing the judge. And Julian Assange is in the back. And then there's a public gallery that is off to, the judge is facing outward. She sees the public gallery. She sees the press on the right. She sees the public gallery on the left. So that just gives you a sense of the layout of the courtroom, which is something that I haven't spoken to yet in doing these reports. But essentially, during the proceedings in the afternoon, she asked Julian if he was having trouble concentrating. Did he need a break? And Assange stood up to make a statement to the court, where then she informed him that as a defendant, he's not allowed to communicate with her and make these kinds of statements unless he's providing evidence for the purposes of the proceedings. And he's asking or talking about points of process. So as he continued to try to complain, and I think he's frustrated because he's not very certain how he's supposed to register his discontent with the judge or his lawyers. He's not satisfied with trying to find some kind of a remedy. And as he's even said, these security guards are standing by him when he talks to his attorney. So he doesn't have any privacy to engage in a kind of discussion of some of these things that, maybe he doesn't want somebody who answers to the Crown Prosecution Service having any idea what kind of case they're working out, because the prosecutor who is pushing this U.S. extradition request comes from that service as well. So I believe that that's one of the biggest points of the day, that going into tomorrow, we don't really know how this is all going to be resolved. But we know that the judge is fully aware that the defendant is having trouble being a participant in the proceedings. And if you're trying to have this appearance of fairness in this, you lose it if Julian Assange doesn't understand what is unfolding in the courtroom.
Thank you for that. That was definitely an important development towards the end of the proceeding. What about, earlier on? What's the argument that, was taking place around whether or not the offenses that the United States would like to extradite Assange on are political in nature or not? And why does that matter? Can you explain that to people?
Yeah. There's just one more thing I wanted to say about the issue of Julian Assange and access to attorneys. It needs to be said that the judge was told by the prosecutor that the prosecution is neutral on whether he would sit with his attorneys. And that, in fact, it was the judge, Vanessa Baretzer, who's being very difficult and suggesting that there couldn't be a security protocol worked out whereby Julian Assange could sit with his attorneys. So before that happened, we had a somewhat tedious day where we were going through these arguments related to political offenses. And political offenses, for those people who are not from the United Kingdom or don't have any familiarity with extradition, treaty law, etc., these are basically crimes or allegations that involve, I'd say, attacks on the state. I think that's the best way to put it, that there's some component of them in which they are, uh, this conduct or behavior is being criminalized because a state says so, and you don't have universality in the sense that you cannot go to all, 170 plus countries of the world and find these crimes in the laws. Uh, so I know we're not talking about like murder or rape. We're not talking about burglary, theft. We're talking about crimes that are created because a government decides that they need to criminalize a particular conduct in order to maintain or constitute their authority, in order to make their ability to govern, I suppose you could say, easier if you were on the government, but if you're a citizen, you feel like they're limiting your freedoms and rights in order to improve security. And I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about, because the political offenses that are focused on in these proceedings are things like treason, sedition, espionage, and even more specifically, this is a charge under the Espionage Act, which means that the defense believes they should be able to directly draw an analogy to espionage in the UK and then look at the treaty and say that that treaty is not one that is supposed to cover political offenses. And so this was a sort of argument that was had in the courtroom today, and the defense was basically arguing that it is very clear throughout the indictment that the political offenses are the basis of this document, that there's hostility in this document in the sense that the United States government has very openly shown that they do not like, they've ascribed motivations to Julian Assange where they believe that he is just anti-American. And so that has a bearing on how you read through the indictment, how you understand the crimes that are alleged. But then also we're talking about the publishing of state secrets, and that is a crime that is a political offense, because the criminalization of that information is a crime to the United States government because they believe he disclosed this information or published this information, and that was contrary to the U.S. interests, which means the key word there is U.S. interests. You're making it a crime for somebody to publish information because it goes against the U.S. government. So expressly, that's a political offense. And because the U.S.-UK extradition treaty is supposedly a treaty that guards against people being extradited for political offenses, then the defense would argue that Julian Assange should not be extradited from the United Kingdom. There's a very salient example of this in the opinion of the defense that involves a former MI5 officer named David Shaler, who was the whistleblower who revealed that the MI6 had plotted to assassinate Muammar Gaddafi. And he was in France, and the UK sought his extradition under the Official Secrets Act, as I understand it. And he was able to win his extradition case and not be extradited because that was recognized by the French appeals court as a political offense. And so Shaler won in these proceedings. And the defense believes that that is similar to what Julian Assange is going through now. Let's get to the over-scrupulous arguments of the prosecution. And the prosecution says that, in fact, if you look at the timeline of extradition law, that Julian Assange does not have this right to raise objections with the political offense aspect of this because Parliament wrote this out of the law in 2003. And so it's no longer there. The UK Extradition Act has nothing about the political offense exception, and it's silent. And the prosecutors are leaning on this to say that then, because it's in the US-UK extradition treaty and not in a domestic law in the UK, then that means that they have to do this by domestic law, and treaty is not domestic law. Yes, this is kind of complicated, and if you feel your eyes glazing over and your tongue getting parched, and you feel like we're losing sight of what's at stake here, which is a human life, someone who's a journalist who they're trying to bring to the United States, I completely empathize with you, because it's really hard to focus. But as I'll argue, it's important to follow these kinds of arguments that the prosecutors are making, because these are the arguments that the judge is going to seek refuge behind or in when she goes to rule. Because obviously, if you're the judge, you would like most not to publish, not to challenge authority. You don't want to be on the wrong side of power, and it's easier for you to approve this extradition request if you can find some way to justify it. And so the prosecutors are using these little tiny finer points in order to say to the judge that yes, despite what the defense is saying, it just isn't right, because Julian Assange does not have a right to argue for the political offense exception, that he can't be extradited to the United States because he's charged with political offenses. And that's essentially the way that arguments went today. That is what we were privy to in following these proceedings. And I can't really say what the defense was able to do that is going to convince the judge that Assange shouldn't be extradited based on the political offense issue. It's a little bit unclear to me how successful this argument is with her, because observing the judge, she was helping the prosecutor advance their argument by questioning the defense before the prosecution had even stepped up to make their own argument in the afternoon. So already it seemed like the judge was receptive to what was going to be said by the prosecutors.
Thank you very much. I know that in about 10 minutes, you're going to be booted out of where you're standing right now and talking to us. So I kind of wanted to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts from today, anything, now that you have 3 days of this under your belt, anything that comes to mind as significant for you in wrapping up.
I'll say I've had an opportunity to meet some wonderful journalists and activists who are here participating in the proceedings. Tonight, I'm actually going to be doing a live podcast with Tariq Haddad. If I can find a link and share it with you, this excellent journalist here in the UK who gained some notoriety because he spoke out on Newsweek when he left the organization because they wouldn't publish his story on the OPCW whistleblower scandal. So I'm going to be talking with him. He's been doing this daily live podcast, talking with individuals who are here at the proceedings, journalists, activists, etc. And so I'm just going to get out of this woman's shot who's doing a live shot here. So I'm going to be doing that. And then to say to you all that, as I've said for the last couple of days, thank you very much for following this work. I recognize that there's a lot going on out there that deserves your attention. I didn't get to watch it because I'm here doing reporting on the Assange proceedings, but there was a Democratic presidential debate and everyone's sucked in to what's happening with the establishment melting down around Bernie Sanders. It seems like the coronavirus continues to grab headlines. There are an array of other stories that people can focus on right now. It certainly seems like if you look at the news business, there are reporters who are struggling to get Assange developments printed and covered on television and in radio because they're competing with these breaking news stories that just are grabbing people's attention much more than what I think is still a very crucially important story about the United States government trying to bring a journalist to the United States to put him on trial in violation of the First Amendment, causing risks to press freedom, but then also as was stated very clearly by the defense today, I don't know how you can accuse somebody of treason when they are not a citizen of that country. And he read off examples of Republicans who had labeled Julian Assange a traitor, suggested he committed treason, labeled him a terrorist. And these political officials, these prosecutors, these are their officials who have talked about Julian Assange in this manner. I repeat this rhetorical question: how can you be guilty of treason when you're not a citizen from that country that's accusing you of treason? Because I think it is a basic, fundamental question about the proceedings that have been unfolding here in London, and one that not only the prosecution should have to grapple with, but the judge should have to grapple with as well when she's making her own decision about approving this extradition. Because whether she has the authority to approve something or not, there should be discretion applied by her, recognizing what's at stake as she lets these dominoes begin to fall. She's certainly not just a part of a legal system in the UK, but what she's doing, I believe, should fall under the parameters of international law, whether she wants to hide behind some kind of technicality that only UK law applies to Julian Assange at this stage. And so the other thing I'll add is that the defense is putting a lot on the record that is going to be useful to them later on as this unfolds over the next couple of years when they go to the higher courts, including the High Court, the Appeal Court, the Supreme Court, and the European Court of Human Rights. Those are going to be levels and stages where you get to hash out, and it's going to be good that already in the record the defense are raising these issues under the umbrella of abusive process that makes it possible for them to raise arguments that might not be possible in those higher levels, in those other courts, if they had not raised them here at the magistrate court level. Once again, thank you to everyone who has been following my work. I really appreciate your support. I don't think I could do this without you. Seeing your feedback, knowing that you're following, gives me an extra boost, extra energy to keep putting forward that extra effort to bring you the details related to what's happening here in this courtroom. And if you can, go to shadowproof.com, throw us a couple bucks, donate to shadowproof.com. I think it's at shadowproof.com/donate, that if you go there, you can give a little bit of money to fund. We just want to defray the costs of travel, the costs of lodging, the costs of being able to go back and forth between to kick in a few bucks to support what we're doing here. I'm going to wrap up because I see the security pacing, and they've had a long day. We've had a long day, and tomorrow will be day 4. And I think we can call it a day right here.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Keep up the excellent work. And thanks to everyone out there who's commenting and sharing and donating. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.